Hello and welcome. I'm Hugh Anderson, Chair of the Las Vegas Metro Chamber of Commerce Government Affairs Committee. As many of you know, the Metro Chamber commissioned a study of Nevada's tax structure from the Tax Foundation, a national tax policy organization located in Washington, D.C. Today's meeting is about the findings and recommendations from that report. We will hear from one of the report's principal authors, Joe Henchman, who will present a summary of the report and its conclusions. At the end of Joe's presentation, we'll take questions from our live studio audience and from those of you viewing over the internet. You can tweet your questions to @LVChamber or email us at questions@lvchamber.com. Joining today's discussion is Carol Villardo, President of the Nevada Taxpayers Association, who will give her perspective on tax stability in Nevada. We'll start with a few words from President and CEO of the Las Vegas Metro Chamber of Commerce, Kristen McMillan.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm very pleased to be here today with everybody here in the studio, as well as those who are watching in their homes or from their offices on the internet. We appreciate so many people taking time out of their day today to participate in this very vital conversation. The Metro Chamber is partnering with Vegas PBS to broadcast online in order to make this conversation as accessible as possible statewide. I want to thank Vegas PBS for having us here in their studio today, and also for providing the technical service that we need to help expand this conversation on tax reform in our state. So reforming Nevada's tax structure this year is a top priority for the Metro Chamber. We believe that the time for reform is now during this 2015 legislative session. It's widely acknowledged that long-term tax stability is badly needed, not only to generate more stability in Nevada's economy, but also to appropriately fund the state's obligations. And that's why the Metro Chamber commissioned a study of our tax system from the Tax Foundation in Washington, D.C., to use that study as a baseline for conversations that are occurring now and will continue to occur throughout the course of our legislative session. So, as we review the various tax plans that will be heard during and before the legislature, the Metro Chamber asked that they be measured against key foundational elements that are embraced by this report. That any tax plan promote the principles of simplicity, neutrality, transparency, and stability, and that any given tax plan does not undermine the important efforts of our state and our communities to grow the economy. Before the program begins, I want to extend a formal thank you to Joe Henchman and the Tax Foundation for their dedication to this project, and also to Carol Villardo of the Nevada Taxpayers Association for joining us today to contribute her expertise and her experience on this topic. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Kristen. We'll turn now to Joe Henchman to present a summary and the findings of the report on Nevada's tax structure. Joe is the Vice President of Legal and State Projects for the Tax Foundation, where he analyzes state trends, constitutional issues, and tax law developments. He has testified or presented to officials in 31 states, testified before Congress 6 times, and has been involved in over 75 major studies on tax policy, including the one he will discuss today that focuses on Nevada. Joe, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you again to the Las Vegas Chamber for their sponsorship of this report. A little bit of background about both the Tax Foundation and how we produced the report, and then we can go into some of the findings that we concluded. We're an old organization. We've been around since 1937, and our focus, of course, is not just Nevada, but the entire United States, looking at federal and state issues across the country and trends and analysis. And I run our state program where we look at what's happening in the 50 states and try to provide a national perspective on a lot of issues. In coming up with this book, our report, Nevada, Simplifying Nevada's Taxes, our process involved almost just about becoming a part-time resident of Nevada over the last 12 months. We've done a number of trips out here. We've met with essentially every stakeholder that we could get time in front of to hear from them, and we asked the same questions out of everybody we met with. What are the strengths of Nevada's tax system? What are the weaknesses? What do the economic trends look like? And my favorite, if you were king, what would you do to change the system? And what's surprising to me is the level of consensus we saw in a lot of the feedback that we got from a wide array, or diverse array of trade associations, business owners, ordinary taxpayers, as I said, and even government officials. And we have a couple slides here just going over some of the key conclusions of the report. The full report is an 84-page document, which we did our best to make not only a discussion of conclusions and recommendations, but also a reference tool for understanding Nevada's tax system. So if you're somebody who's just encountering the tax system for the first time in Nevada and wanting to learn about it, or if you're Carol Villardo, who has forgotten more about Nevada's tax system than most of us will ever learn, it's meant to be a book for you. And of course, you can get it for free at the Chamber's website or at the Tax Foundation website. I'm going to do a bit of a disservice in kind of just going over some broad strokes, but there's a lot of beautiful charts and information illustrating a lot of these points throughout the publication. First, a little bit about Nevada's tax system generally. I don't think this is a surprise to a lot of people, but on a national basis, on a relative basis, Nevada's taxes are low, and that helps make the state competitive. At the same time, the structure of the existing tax system almost maximizes volatility. I don't need to tell any Nevadan who's been here the last several years that the economic situation produced a lot of volatility with the housing crisis and what happened with construction, and how gaming was affected by the change in discretionary income of people traveling. But the tax system magnified that volatility. It made it even worse than if you had had a tax system that was better designed. And the primary reason for that is the dependence on volatile sectors. Nevada in the 1960s essentially set up a tax system predicated on the notion that the state's economy was gaming and mining. And just to a large extent, Nevada's tax system hasn't really changed a wide degree from that original formulation. So when gaming takes a hit or when mining takes a hit, both of which happened in the wake of the recession, it really does a number on state and local finance. So just generally, Nevada has narrow taxes, outdated taxes, and complex taxes. And we think that this, the ultimate conclusion that we reached is it's a good time to start thinking about ways to modernize the tax system. And this is especially important as Nevada starts thinking about diversifying its economy, moving away from primarily gaming, primarily mining, and looking at other opportunities. And of course, the governor in his State of the State address talked about a lot of those, a lot more manufacturing, a lot more kind of digital new internet technologies, and a lot more services. In order to really attract those, Nevada has to have a tax system to reflect that. In many ways, I would almost say Nevada's tax system, it's not one broad tax, of course. It's almost a series of industry-specific taxes. And something I've been mentioning in a lot of our meetings has been starting to think about the tax system as more than just the sum of the parts, more than just 20 or 30 or 40 industry-specific taxes, but a tax system that if you're a manufacturer in California looking to expand, or if you're a service provider in New York looking to expand, or if you're a business in Illinois looking to get out of that state, that you can understand what your Nevada tax bill would be without having to get Carol's excellent book on calculating property taxes, or without having to negotiate a special deal to understand what your sales tax or business tax liability will be. Because I think a lot of that happens now. It was also especially important in what we look through is, because this happens quite a bit in Nevada. You know, we've talked with Carol quite a bit over the history of how Nevada's tax system came to be and the changes over time. And oftentimes people say, well, we just need to enact this silver bullet tax, and that'll solve all of our problems. It'll raise the revenue, and it won't affect the economy, and nobody will notice. And you know, I work for the Tax Foundation in Washington, D.C., and you know, you heard it from me, there's really not a lot new in the world of tax. If there's a tax idea out there, somebody, somewhere, over the last several thousand years has tried it. And if there's a tax that nobody else has, or even worse, a tax that lots of people once had and they've all gotten rid of it, there's usually a pretty good reason for that. And so we talk about things like the Washington B&O tax, the Ohio CAT tax, the Texas margin tax, gross receipts taxes. These are all taxes that either states are moving away from or have moved away from, or even nations have moved away from because of the economic damage that they can do. Corporate income taxes are still very popular at the state level, of course, and that comes up every now and then as an idea for Nevada. However, it's worth noting that they're on the decline. Back in the 1970s, they were raising almost 10% of state revenue. Today, it's closer to 3 or 4%. And a lot of that's because a company today that maybe in the 1970s would have been what we call a C corporation, an incorporated corporation, is today structured as a S corporation or an LLC or an LLP or even a sole proprietorship. And there's lots of theories about why that's happening, but because it's kind of a uniquely American phenomenon, but it certainly is happening. And all of these businesses are paying taxes at the federal level. They're just paying them under the individual tax code, not under the corporate tax code, and that's flowing through at the state level. So that's another reason why state corporate income taxes are declining as a revenue source. And indeed, some scholars, including those on the left, are starting to predict that state corporate income taxes might even be extinct in the next 20 years. And the other caution I would give about state corporate income taxes is they are the most volatile revenue source in state and local finance. In good years, corporations can earn a good profit. I think it was just announced Apple had an $18 billion quarter, which is, I wish I had the problem of figuring out what to do with an extra $18 billion in profit. At the same time, there's companies that have bad quarters or bad years, and it's almost the exact opposite there. And that's why you'll see, and we've got a wonderful chart in the book, and we've done some showing California's taxes over time, where, in good times, yeah, you get a lot of revenue, but in bad times it drops very hard, and that's precisely when the state finances are in trouble. So you got to be careful about a tax that will magnify the very problem that you're trying to solve with respect to volatility. And those are some of the the broad themes that we looked at. We have a chapter each on a couple of Nevada's different taxes. We have a chapter on the sales tax and the live entertainment tax. Sales tax, of course, is a vital part of Nevada's state and local finance. It funds schools, it funds state government to a large degree. At the same time, though, it's been eroding over time. The very first state to adopt a sales tax was Mississippi in 1930. And it was Mississippi in 1930, so they designed the sales tax to reflect the economy at that time, which was goods, primarily agricultural, rural, goods-based economy. And so that's what their tax applied to. Every state since Mississippi to adopt a sales tax did what state legislators do, and they copied what the guy before them had done. And so that's how we get most states in the United States, all but 3 actually, that tax sales, doing so only taxing goods and usually not taxing services. Well, our economy today is not the economy of Mississippi in 1930. In fact, 2/3 of our economy now is services. And in Nevada, it's even more. Nevadans have embraced services much more than your average state. Almost 70 or 80% of Nevada's economy is services. And as that has changed, as goods have declined as a share of the economy and services has risen, that's narrowed out the base of the sales tax. So today, only about 30% of what Nevadans buy is subject to the sales tax. And so that's meant that the rate has had to go up over time. So the rate started out, what did it start out at, Carol?
It started out as actually 2%.
2% back in
1955.
1955. Today, of course, 6.85 at the state level plus local rates. So here in Las Vegas, for instance, it's over 8%. So instead of having an 8% tax on 30% of transactions, what public finance scholars suggest is evening that out and maybe having a bit of a lower rate on more transactions. And in the book, we provide 3 different options for expanding the base to more things. So, and you can do everything from, keeping what you got, of course, to the other end of all final sales of all goods and services subject to the sales tax. And you get the rate down pretty low, down to about 5% if you wanted to go in that direction on a revenue neutral basis. And of course, every idea in between. If you want to make sure health services are not taxed, if you want to make sure education services, and you can kind of take out whatever. But we laid out kind of a spectrum of options with respect to the sales tax. We have a chapter on business taxes. Nevada has a business tax called the modified business tax. It came in a couple of years ago, and it kind of struck us in talking to business owners how they view the tax as simple, as easy to understand, as controllable. We heard a number of people say, I can figure this out on one sheet of paper, which I can assure you people are not saying about the Washington B&O tax or state corporate income taxes or any other kind of business tax that's out there in the United States. And we also have a chart in the book of the MBT's collections over time, and it's not much different from a flat line there, even during the recession. And that's not what Nevada's property tax collection chart looks like. That's not what Nevada's sales tax collection looks like, but the MBT stayed pretty stable. It was an oasis of stability for Nevada's otherwise very volatile tax system. So this is a tax that is simple, it's stable, and it's neutral in the extent that all businesses pay it. No business is exempt from it. A couple of years ago, there was a dollar threshold exemption put in, so the first $85,000 is exempt. In the book, we talk about maybe rolling that back, bringing everybody back into it, and providing some options. So if you wanted to have everybody pay it but raise no more revenue, you could bring the rate down to about 1%. If you wanted to raise about $400 million, you could bring everybody into it, raise it to about 2%. And this is a tax that already exists. Every business in Nevada already knows how to pay it. The state government knows how to collect it. And I think there's an optical part of it of making sure that businesses stepping to the table and paying its fair share. And we heard that from quite a number of people in the interviews too. And in terms of all of the business tax options out there in the United States, this is a pretty good one, to the extent a tax can be a good tax. We also have a chapter on the property tax. And this took a lot of work for us to understand, because Nevada's property tax is unique compared to other states. It has a number of features that exist in no other state. Nevada's property taxes have a depreciation factor that exists in no other state. Nevada's property tax is calculated on the basis of replacement cost that exists in no other state. And Nevada allows business property owners to essentially choose between a couple of different options for how their tax is calculated. And that exists in no other state. And in addition to that, Nevada has a property tax cap. Property tax caps are more popular. They exist in quite a few states. But there's and it came in Nevada when, of course, in the run-up to 2007, 2008, when property values were heading into the stratosphere, and there was real danger that people were going to get thrown out of their homes because they couldn't keep up with the bills. And so the idea was, let's cap how fast these assessments and these bills are going up. The unintended consequence, though, of something people didn't think of, is what happens when the values come down. And so we had the cap, making sure that people's bills were not going higher than where that cap was. When property assessments dropped, as we all know they did during the recession, the cap fell with them. So as assessments now recover, as property values recover, it's taken a couple of years, but their home values are starting to come back now. The tax cap limits how fast the tax collections can go up. So instead of taxes recovering for local governments in 6 or 7 or 8 years, it's going to take 20 or 25 years. And of course, throughout all this time, local governments are expected to continue providing the same level of services that they've always provided before. We certainly don't think anything should be done retroactively on this. People have built their expectations into the system, but this downward ratchet, as we call it, it's a feature that nobody intended to be in the property tax, and nobody foresaw that it would cause these problems. And it's just something that should be fixed so that the next time this happens, and nobody wants there to be another problem like there was back then. But if it does happen again, this won't cause the same kind of problems that it did before. And we talk about that and a number of options to make property taxes more understandable for homeowners. Generally, we don't dive into a lot of property tax recommendations when we go into states and talk about options and what's going on in the country, because it's primarily a local finance issue. But we thought it was important for Nevada because it's one of the few broad-based taxes Nevada has, and of course it's a mainstay of local government, and only the state can solve these problems. So if taxes are going to be a big issue in this legislative session, and it's looking like they will be, talking about ways to address the MBT, the sales tax, and the property tax are part of it. Nevada also has, of course, the live entertainment tax, and we kind of rolled that into the sales tax section because it you know, the old saying, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, call it a duck. It looked a lot like a sales tax to us. And Marilyn Kirkpatrick in the Assembly has done a lot of great work talking about the problems with the live entertainment tax. It's arbitrary. Whether I mean, if we could count this as live entertainment, and you know, you all were eating and drinking and buying drinks and everything here in the audience, you know, if I were to grab a microphone and walk out into the audience, that would change whether or not the live entertainment tax was put on your bills. And it's the line drawing of like so many seats counts and so many seats doesn't count, the exemptions in it, so things like Burning Man and Electric Daisy Carnival and NASCAR, they're exempt, but a lot of smaller venues have to pay it. So there's a lot of problems associated with it, and our idea in this is, well, if you're looking at broadening the sales tax, just apply the sales tax to everything. So instead of some people paying sales tax, and some people paying sales tax and LET, and some people paying nothing, and everybody jockeying to see which category they fit in, just do the sales tax on everything. Everybody understands what they have to pay. Nobody has a way out of it, and it's predictability for the taxpayer and for state financial officials in calculating things. So that's kind of a broad run-through of the recommendations in the book and some of the analysis behind them. And I, just as one last word, I want to express appreciation to everybody we met with. I know we met with a lot of busy people who carved out time to talk to these people from Washington, D.C. and teach them how Nevada's tax system works. I fully understand, you know, I'm a Californian by birth. I'm not a Nevadan, and I freely admit that. But you know, I've had a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed the hospitality of Nevadans in being in the state and in coming up with these recommendations. And we offer these not in the spirit of some Washington, D.C. group coming in and telling you what you need to do, but in as kind of an outsider, taking a fresh perspective at what we see, understanding the national perspective of what other states are doing, and making some suggestions to help start a conversation about if you are going to tackle taxes this year, what are some ideas that can make sure that Nevada stays competitive, simplifies things for taxpayers, and solves the problems of volatility and arbitrariness that exist in the current tax system.
Thank you, Joe. We'll now move to the question and answer period of the program. If you have a question, please approach the designated microphone in the studio and wait to be recognized. In the interest of addressing everyone's questions, please keep them brief and to the point. If you're watching from home, you can ask your questions via Twitter by mentioning @LVChamber or by sending them to questions@lvchamber.com. Joining us for the discussion period now is Carol Velardo, President of the Nevada Taxpayers Association. Carol has held that position for 25 years, during which she has focused on the state's fiscal issues, a widely recognized and universally respected figure when it comes to public finance policy in Nevada. Carol has led the Nevada Taxpayers Association's growth into an organization known for its advocacy of sound fiscal policies and promoting the cause of the taxpayer for responsible government at a reasonable price. Thank you for joining us, Carol.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Great. Why don't we start, Joe, would you elaborate on the types of people you interviewed so folks understand that it was as broad a base of input as you could possibly talk about?
I mean, to be honest, we sent out about, we made a list, I think, of about 150 different people and organizations, and we sent out a flurry of invitations. And anybody who said yes, we made time and met with them. A few we had to do via phone just because schedules had trouble to meet. And this was over 3 lengthy trips to Nevada. So we, specifically for interviews, altogether we've done about a dozen trips to Nevada over the last 12 months. You know, a wide array of people, everything from small business owners to trade associations to local government officials and even ordinary taxpayers. I mean, it was tough to encounter me in the last year in Nevada without me quizzing you on your thoughts of Nevada's tax system.
Excellent, excellent. How important will the principles be in formulating sound tax policy for the state?
Well,
And if you can elaborate what they are again.
Oh yeah, of course. All the research that we do at the Tax Foundation is guided by the idea that taxes, to the extent possible, can be simple, neutral, transparent, and stable. And it's, you know, as Benjamin Franklin said, there's death and taxes are inevitable. And you know, is there even such a good thing as a good tax? But there are better and worse ways to raise a dollar of revenue. And these are some of the touchstones that at least we at the Tax Foundation feel like can be unifying principles for analyzing tax issues. And of course we didn't come up with them. They were originally devised by economist Adam Smith, who almost 250 years ago sat down and as we think, as the first person who ever really mused about what are some guidestones for designing taxes that we should try to abide by, and hopefully everybody can agree with those. And it's important to, and I think a lot of examples of bad taxes that have happened over the years have failed one or more of those principles.
Right. Ryan, do you have some questions?
Yes, we have one question from the internet. It is to Joe and Carol, well, specifically Joe because it's your study. You mentioned that changing the valuation method in the property tax from a cost method to a market value-based method. How will changing the valuation method have a positive effect in tax revenue when the property tax cap is still in place? Would you recommend eliminating the property tax cap altogether, or at least the commercial property tax?
Oh, those are quite a few questions all at once. And of course, we go into more detail in the chapter of the book on property taxes. But essentially, we talked about the tried and true way of collecting property tax that happens in other states, which is, you know, you buy your property, and that's what your assessment is set at. Every couple of years, the assessor comes around, and if you've built a new room, or if they've opened something nearby that's dramatically increased property values, that's accounted for. And then there's the percentage rate applied to it. So every year, if it's 1% of your assessed value, you send that in. That's understandable. I think people can get their heads around it. That's not how Nevada's property taxes work, of course. There's a lot of unique features that make it very hard for even ordinary homeowners to understand what their taxes will be year over year. And so we talk about kind of moving away from that system towards one that's more understandable for taxpayers. It's entirely up to, I mean, all of this is entirely up to Nevadans to decide what you want to do, if anything. But I would suggest, and we do suggest in the book, that if you are going to do it slowly, do it over time, make sure it's phased in, because we don't want anyone thrown out of their home because they don't understand changes that are happening. And I think we talked about a 10-year phase-in for some of these features.
Right. Carol, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. Joe had mentioned before, the last thing we changed on property tax was the abatement because of the economic situation. There are a lot of things we could do to stabilize the tax. Unfortunately, unless we get some modification to the abatement, you can eliminate depreciation, you can try to clean up some of the appeals processes. None of it will work if you don't change the partial abatement. So when you talk about phasing in and doing things, that is really the first thing that the legislature is going to have to tackle. To the other end, to get to market value, as Joe's talking about, the Legislature Legal Counsel has previously opined that's a constitutional change. So when Joe talks about steps, he's absolutely correct. There are steps that you would take for an orderly transition and to have the taxpayer understand and respond with their opinions.
Speaking of the Constitution, of course, Nevada has a provision in its Constitution that says all property taxes need to be uniform between different categories of people, different categories of taxpayers. That's not what the abatement does. The abatement has the one cap for residential and then the different cap for commercial property owners. And we heard from quite a few people that we talked to that the general consensus of people that understand these issues is that that's probably unconstitutional. And we're just kind of waiting around hoping that nobody will bring this to court. I find that very alarming to serve as a basis for a cornerstone of state and local finance in Nevada. And we strongly suggest in the book moving that to a permanent and unquestionably constitutional basis. So right now you've got the 8% for commercial and is it 3?
A carve out of 3%.
3% for residential. So whether you make that, and so that, generally taxes can't go up more than 3% a year for residential or up more than 8% for commercial. So whether you just make everything 3 or you make everything 8 or you pick some number in the middle, but something that satisfies that constitutional requirement that everything be the same for all property tax owners and sticking to it. And that would be, I think, an essential first step, as Carol noted.
Hugh, if I may, something I'd like to address on the report. Joe knows we've had a number of tax studies because I'm sure they have reviewed them. One of the things that their study does is it doesn't invent anything new. What it does is build on what we have and look at the current economy. If you go back to the recent studies, let's say the Pricewaterhouse Urban Institute study in '88 that was delivered to the '89 legislature, had a provision in there that we should be taxing services. Okay, that's not a new idea. A good tax structure reflects your economy and it reflects the way business is done. And we've been hindered on looking at any changes to services, adding to sales tax, because of the requirement that voters approve on the 2%. And the question is, how do you pose it? Do you categorize sections of the economy for services? Do you specify or what? So that's been an ongoing discussion because the state is, again, as indicated in the report, was the first state to go service-oriented on gross state product from the service census, over 50% back in '85. We were the first state with that much in services, and now, as Joe has indicated, we're close to 70%. And that's not reflected in the economy. The live entertainment tax, many of us have said, get rid of the live entertainment tax and make that your first part of the services tax as an amusement admissions tax. The mechanism's in place, you know the people that are paying the tax currently, get rid of the exemptions. Our position has been that before you look for the silver bullet, which doesn't exist, that you correct the infirmities within the existing system. Because the most important thing you can do, and it's like if you add services, you reduce the rate somewhat, even if you phase in a rate reduction down, is you want to create the stability, but what you want to do before you create a new tax is know exactly what a reformed or restructured tax system is going to bring in. So that when you look at a new tax, you're looking at it with the idea that it would have the lowest rate possible so nobody makes a spending decision. And we can't seem to get beyond the politics or the hype in what this group is trying to do to this group. That's ridiculous. So hopefully with the report, with the Metro Chamber doing this, we're happy with it. A number of these issues that are addressed, my board has had positions on ranging from 1990 to 3 years ago when we review them. So we're definitely supportive of taking a look at these changes, and we are supportive of sales tax on services, and we think it's got to be very judiciously done. In the beginning, we would not agree per se with Joe's third chart, where you tax everything on services. That presents its own set of problems, and you can't easily do that for the end of this legislative session. But there are things you can do to get you into that mold and work towards it.
If I can be devil's advocate, Joe had mentioned about making sure that business is at the table paying quote-unquote their fair share. The critique of the sales tax on service is that business gets to pass it through to the end consumer, regardless of the definition of consumer. Would you both address that critique?
Well, I would address it because I think there's a recommendation in the report that is valid. If you specifically are taxing business services, yes, to the extent a business can increase their price to pass it on or that they can absorb it, they will. If you have a definition, now this is very simplistic, but let's say you were to define the ultimate consumer as the end user, and you had a service that would go business to business at 2 levels before the ultimate consumer got it. The recommendation is do what you do for use tax or sales tax right now. You give a resale certificate number. Now, it takes working out, and I don't think you'd want to do that, or we'd have time to do it in this session, but it's something that could be worked at as an expansion for the following session so that you're not pyramiding the tax.
Understood.
I mean, that's important to look out for, and any business tax is going to be passed on in some form to somebody else. Businesses are just legal pieces of paper in a filing drawer in the Secretary of State's office. And all business taxes are paid in some form by the consumers who buy the products or services of that business, the workers who work for that business in the form of lower wages, or the profits that shareholders receive. So if you say, you know, every business needs to pay 10% of what they earn, it's not magically coming from somewhere else. It's coming from one of those 3 categories in some degree. And that's important to be kept in mind. And nevertheless, for optical reasons, a lot of states think it's very important that businesses contribute something, especially for the benefits they get from the state, things like perpetual life, the ability to sue and be sued, limited liability, and so forth. It's important to structure them in a way so that it's simple, so that it's not, you don't have to create whole new wings of the corporation to collect the tax, and to make sure that it's not being punitive, and making sure that it's not standing in the way of growth. Yeah.
Ryan, you have some more questions?
Yes. The next question from the internet asks if any of the options recommended in the report or suggested in the report provide the state with immediate revenue.
Yes, the MBT option, if you were to go to kind of the outside option there of every business pays it and pays 2%, which some businesses are paying now, but a lot of them are paying 1.17%. That would raise an additional $400 million a year, or $800 million over the biennium. And of course, if you wanted less than that, you could reduce the percentage from there. As I said, that's a tax that the state is collecting right now, that businesses are paying right now, so that's relatively easy to meter up, and in fact the state's done that a couple of times in the past couple of years. Sales tax, I would agree with Carol. A sales tax on services, you probably want a bit of a rollout time on that, whether you enact it and then kind of use the revenue to pay down the rate in future years, or if you want to kind of, and I think the governor even mentioned this in the State of the State, collect information on it for a year before you start thinking about how to roll it out. That's another option there. The property tax probably won't be a big revenue change. The suggestions we make for changing the property tax, it won't really change people's bills all that much immediately. What we're talking about is fundamentally fixing the system so that it doesn't produce crises the next time something like this happens.
Carol, anything to add to that?
Nope, I think Joe did very well. I mean, you'll get some revenue from live entertainment. Some of it will be immediate, not all of it. And that would be by doing nothing more than eliminating exemptions.
And, you know, with all due respect to Nevada's governors and legislators over the past several decades, and, you know, if I'm being unfair, you can all throw things at me, but I would almost characterize Nevada's tax system, the evolution of Nevada's tax system, as every couple of years, we need revenue. Quick, pick an industry, and let's design a tax to hit that industry to produce the revenue that we need. And that's how you get Nevada's tax system, as this collection of weird, almost unique, narrow and high taxes on all sorts of different things. And it's an important theme that we drive home in the book, that it might be a good opportunity now to take a step back and think about a tax system that applies to everybody and is not just this collection of punitive industries. And, you know, the gaming industry knows that more than anybody else in Nevada. They've been a mainstay of the state's economy and the state's fiscal structure for many, many years. And, you know, they're going to continue to be that and continue to be important, but they're not going to be the growth sector that is going to produce you know, state financing for all sorts of new programs in the years to come. Gaming revenues, for the most part, have been flat the last couple of years. Entertainment associated with gaming, the restaurants and the clubs and everything, that's been growing. But, I mean, you just have to look at Atlantic City to know that you have to be careful about over-relying on that sector and just thinking we just need to, you know, raise the slots tax and we'll be able to cover it. So, you know, I would kind of plead with all of you to move away from this, well, we just need to come up with a new tax on them and, you know, get 20 million there and 50 million here and that'll solve all of these problems. When, I mean, you already have a tax system that is not reflecting the modern economy, and addressing those issues, not ignoring them and then layering something on top of it, would be the recommendation.
Now, you both have touched on collection apparatus at the state level, and it's preferable to have an already existing collection structure. Do any of the recommendations in the report require us to expand the state apparatus to collect or create anything new?
Not the MBT or the property tax recommendations. The LET recommendations probably would reduce complexity. Right now, the LET is administered by two different entities which have two different sets of rules. We suggest collapsing that all back into the Department of Taxation. The sales tax on services, if the state goes down that road, would take some work in coming up with the definitions, deciding what needs to be taxed, and coming up with rules associated with it. But this is something that a number of states already do. This is something that a number of countries already do. So there are off-the-shelf opportunities that Nevada can pull and work from. So it's not like it's starting completely from scratch. There are ideas that are out there that we do not include in the report as recommendations. In fact, we include them as warnings. Things like the Washington B&O tax.
Can you elaborate on what that is?
Sure,
Many
it's
folks may not know what
the
it is.
Washington Business and Occupation tax, the Texas margin tax, the Ohio CAT tax. These are taxes which, well, let me kind of walk in. I think you're all familiar with the margin tax, and obviously a Nevada version of it was defeated at the ballot last November. Kind of every public finance scholar you can find would warn you about anything resembling any three of these taxes. I think any business owner from any of these states would warn you against any of these taxes. The Washington B&O tax, how it's structured is they have 35 different categories for types of businesses. So agricultural businesses pay this rate, and you know, somebody somewhere kind of divined, to use that word you used earlier, what the rate would be. So for them, the right rate is this, and for wholesalers, the right rate is this, and for retailers, the right rate is this. And Nevada's had this for about 70 years. A number of other states used to have a tax like this. They've all repealed it. Washington's the only one left. And every year's legislative session is everybody fighting over their rate. You know, I want my rate to be lower, and I want my rate to be lower, and it's really fragmented the business community pretty effectively and prevented them from repealing it. It's done one other horrible thing for Washington State's economy is it's led to a vertical integration of businesses. So if, you know, wholesalers pay a really low rate, guess what? Everybody wants to be a wholesaler. And so everybody's eager for wholesalers to buy them or to convert themselves to wholesalers. So Washington State's economy is a lot of very complex conglomerates of a lot of different types of businesses. And it's really made it hard for Washington businesses to compete in the international markets because the tax system encourages them to structure themselves in a way that makes them uncompetitive, but is tax advantaged. And you know, there's any number of studies. Carol mentioned the Price Waterhouse study, and any number of experts that can warn about taxes along these lines. And you don't need, and it takes a lot of enforcement power and everything to collect them. And you don't need to do something like that. You have the makings of a good tax system already with the MBT, the sales tax, and your property taxes. And it can produce the revenue you need, and you can do it in a modernized way. But the focus really ought to be on fixing those flaws. And we did our best to try to identify all of them for you in one 84-page book and provide options on how to address them. And you know, if you're concerned about the stability of state revenues, if you're concerned about how complex it is, if you're concerned about how unfair it is of businesses being treated differently and individuals being treated differently, we try to resolve all of those in what we put together.
I think the other thing that happens with the Washington B&O tax for my members that have businesses up there is you have those categories, but you've got subsets within that because people have lobbied for exemptions or lower rates within a category, and it's been accommodated. It's the politics of taxation does not always coincide with policy.
Right, absolutely. Ryan, you have another question?
Yes, the next question that we have is, do you have any recommendations in the book about business licensing fees?
We do go into that a little bit in that we look at what other states do and what they collect. Almost every state has a business license fee, some charge for types of businesses for the privileges that you get as being a separate entity recognized by law. Nevada is actually already pretty high on those. And Nevada is kind of the second most popular place for a business to be located legally after Delaware. About half of American corporations are located in Delaware. And that may be changing. So actually Nevada is very well poised to kind of take advantage of any problems Delaware might encounter on that. There's a little bit of room for that. I think an idea that we include in the book is graduating it a little bit, so by types of revenue or by types of business, so maybe have C Corps pay a little bit more compared to S Corps or LLCs and so forth. But for it to be a fee, and I've written a book on the difference between taxes and fees, and you can see that at our Tax Foundation website. The fee has to be going for some benefit that company is receiving. Anything that's kind of raised to fund other things, that's more properly characterized as a tax. And so we found, you know, if you really push the limit and kind of match Delaware on what they're charging, you could raise maybe an additional $14 million a year. So it's not going to solve the state's $200 million budget gap or fund, you know, a couple $100 million new spending program. It can help. It can get you a little bit of the way there. If you were to go to maybe a fee for different types of business, you could get a little bit more out of that. But it's not going to raise $400 million a year in a way that doesn't do disservice to the word licensing fee.
Right. Carol, you mentioned the politics of it all. If the folks that Joe had asked about, if you were king or queen for a day and you had your choice, if some of these recommendations, whether it's from the foundation or the legislature, comes to a better conclusion, what will that do for the political discussion going forward in terms of not having the tax discussion every session consuming so much of the time and energy of our leadership?
It would
and yours.
be absolutely wonderful if it would have happened. Look, the reality is that we all want revenue for those things that we want government to provide for us. Roads, fire protection, whatever it is. Not all of us want to pay for it or pay the level that there is. And that's what adds to the political element, because the people who can press the green button or press the red button are the ones that have to face constituents, and they're going to be concerned about the reaction of their constituents. So having good policy discussions sometimes gets to be very difficult, but I think we have an opportunity to really start on that road this year. At least I really hope we do.
And that concludes today's discussion. Thank you to Joe Henchman, as well as Carol Velardo, and the staff of Vegas PBS. For more information or to view the report in its entirety, you can visit lvchamber.com. This broadcast will be available within the next week for review, also at lvchamber.com. On behalf of Krista McMillan and the Las Vegas Metro Chamber of Commerce, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you benefited from this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
It was a pleasure.
Excellent job, Joe. Thank you.